Hello, and welcome to 7 Questions for a Space Historian. My name is Geoff Nunn. I am the museum's space curator, and I'm also a volunteer with NASA's Solar System Ambassadors Program. And I am going to answer some questions from the internet. Question 1. Username Moist Muffins asks, when JFK said, "We choose to go to the moon," did he really know it was possible?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
First off, that speech was not when the decision to try to go to the moon was made, or even announced. That came over a year prior to that during a speech to a joint session of Congress. And at that time, Kennedy announced a moon landing within the 1960s as a goal for the space program. And that came about in part because in 1961, Kennedy was having a bit of a rough time at the start of his term. The Russians, the Soviets, had just launched Yuri Gagarin into space as the first human in space the previous month. And then the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba had failed and was proving to be a tremendous disaster. So Kennedy was looking for a way to get things back on the right track. He had been working very closely with officials within NASA as well as within his administration to figure out, okay, how can we set a finish line for the space race that we can win? What they realized was if we're going to land astronauts on the moon, it's going to require both us and the Soviets to build rockets that are big enough to launch those astronauts safely and technologies for landing, and it evened the playing field in order to ensure that we could win the space race. And so that was the context in which he gave this Rice University speech. It was to help promote the space program that was still in its early days. So I guess the short answer is no, he didn't know for sure that we could land on the moon, but that was also not when that decision to try to go was made. Question 2. Username What Is This 7 Now asks, are there any plans on visiting any of the original Apollo landing sites when we get back to the moon? All right, 7 Now, grab your Jack Skellington hoodie because this is a hot topic. You may know that we are actually back in sort of a moon rush, an effort to get back to the moon. NASA has implemented what is called the Artemis program, and that is an effort to return astronauts to land on the moon by around 2030, 2028. The dates keep shifting a little bit, but we are actively moving forward with this. However, there are a bunch of other countries and other programs that are also trying to do a similar thing. And we are targeting largely not where the Apollo landing sites landed along the near side of the moon, but we're looking at the lunar South Pole. And that's because there's water ice there. And there's also mountaintops that are in permanent sunlight. So it's an ideal spot to set up a permanent moon base. But with all of these activities going back towards the moon, there's a lot of concern about what to do and how to protect the original Apollo landing sites. And some of what's being talked about is, can we visit some of the sites? Do we preserve Apollo 11 as the first spot where humans touch down and allow us to go back to some other sites in order to gain scientific knowledge about what happens to human technology when it spends 50 plus years in the lunar environment? There's also some concern about, even if we're landing a long distance away from these sites, what potential damage could occur? Because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, and every time you land, you kick up a lot of that lunar regolith, that moon dust. Space historians, as well as space companies, are starting to talk about this question of how do we preserve human heritage as we move out further into the solar system. There's also conversations with local groups. The city of Kent, just south of the Museum of Flight here in Seattle, successfully declared the lunar rovers, which were built in Kent, Washington, as Washington state landmarks. So we're looking at ways that we can apply laws that protect heritage here on Earth to operations in space. And so time will tell whether or not we go back to visit these lunar landing sites, but we want to make sure that when we do so responsibly and we do so carefully. Question 3. Username Deleted said, if there's no gravity in space, how did humans drive a car on the moon? Well, Deleted, there is gravity in space. In fact, gravity kind of rules space. Anytime you have matter, matter causes gravity. And so here on Earth, we experience what we refer to as 1g of gravity. And the moon, you get about 1/6 that amount. So the astronauts who landed on the moon and were driving the lunar rovers around, those were designed to operate in 1/6 Earth's gravity. And astronauts who are in orbit are being held in orbit by the gravity of the body that they're around. So if astronauts on the International Space Station, they're basically falling around the Earth but missing. So gravity is all present in space. It keeps astronauts on the moon, it keeps us here on Earth. It also keeps all of the planets orbiting the sun around the center of the solar system. So when you say there's no gravity in space, we don't feel gravity when we're in space. It's because we get far enough away that the effects of gravity on our bodies while we're in our spacecraft aren't noticeable. Question 4. Username Alaska Fish asks, what was the point of the space shuttle? Why was it used rather than traditional rockets? We had been thinking about space shuttles since well before the Apollo program. In fact, the idea for a space plane originates all the way back at least as early as World War II. So the space shuttle was proposed officially actually in 1969 in a meeting between NASA officials and President Nixon's Space Task Group. And this meeting was focused on what are we going to do after Apollo. And what NASA had in mind was a proposal that would have a reusable space shuttle put in place in order to build a space station. And then that space station would help us to gain new knowledge and serve as a jumping off point for a landing on Mars by 1986. Mission accomplished. NASA had these grand proposals, and this was going in front of the presidential administration. But at the time, we were in the middle of a recession, and NASA's budget was tightening significantly. So the Apollo spacecraft was great for short-term exploration, but it couldn't sustain astronauts or haul cargo like the space shuttle could. The space shuttle could bring about 50 to 60,000 pounds of cargo into orbit. So from the beginning, the purpose of the space shuttle was to build a space station. It just took time to get both of those projects into a budget to actually act on. And so now we do have the International Space Station, which has been in orbit over our heads with astronauts living and working on board for over 20 years, largely thanks to the space shuttle. Question 5. Duck versus Chippendale. Why does NASA still use Soyuz to bring some astronauts to the International Space Station? Because of commercial crew, they don't need the Soyuz anymore, and SpaceX is cheaper than using the Soyuz. This is correct in a sense. We used to be paying, it started I think at $50 million a seat on Soyuz after Shuttle retired, and then the cost increased. But now that SpaceX is flying and launching astronauts from the US again, it actually doesn't cost us anything to launch astronauts on Soyuz, because NASA and Roscosmos have gone from a seat purchase structure to a seat swap structure. So you will always see with missions to the International Space Station, you will see US astronauts paired up with Russian cosmonauts. And whether they are flying on Soyuz or SpaceX's Dragon capsule, it will always be a mixed nationality crew. And part of this is because with the agreements on how the International Space Station operates, there is always at least one NASA astronaut and at least one Russian cosmonaut on board the space station as part of the crew. Question 6. Username Herp McDerp asks, how does a private company go about launching its own satellite? Commercial and private satellites have been going up for a long time, and if you think about it, we've been using them for a long time. If you had satellite television, which really kind of ramped up, as early as when I was a kid, that was a private company operating its satellite. The very first amateur satellite actually launched in 1961. It was called Oscar 1, and this was a ride-along from a team of Lockheed employees alongside a spy satellite that was going into orbit. So it was this kind of private experiment that went up with a large government payload. And that's honestly something that still happens today. A company wanting to launch its own satellite typically doesn't launch it themselves. They usually work with a launch provider. So that would be a separate company, someone like Boeing or United Launch Alliance, or lately, for the past 10 years or so, SpaceX has been dominating the launch market in the United States. You can build a satellite for about the price of a used car now if you go with what's called the CubeSat standard. So I have an example here of a CubeSat in the museum's collection. So with a CubeSat, a 1U CubeSat weighs about 2 to 3 pounds, and the cost is often dependent on the weight of the satellite. So a 1U CubeSat costs less than $10,000 a pound to reach Earth orbit. So now you can get small startup companies or even university programs that can actually have their own satellite. And question 7 from Title Suck is, would it be possible for an astronaut to hold on to a spaceship in space while it was traveling? Well, this happens pretty much all the time. Anytime an astronaut goes on a spacewalk, they are holding on to a spacecraft that's moving. So with the space shuttle, the International Space Station, or any spacecraft in Earth orbit, they're actually traveling very, very fast. Orbital velocity at the International Space Station is about 17,400 miles an hour. So if you think about it, supersonic aircraft travel about 2,000 miles an hour. So you're going way faster than any aircraft in Earth's atmosphere, and yet you're still able to go on a spacewalk and it looks serene and peaceful. And that's because of a couple of things. One, the astronaut's velocity is matching the space station's velocity because they've been on board and they're traveling at the same orbital velocity. But also, space is a vacuum. So you don't have 17,500 mile an hour winds that are going to knock you off of the spacecraft. So in short, yes, whenever an astronaut is on a spacewalk, they are holding on to a spacecraft that is traveling very fast. Thanks for the questions and for watching. If you like content like this, if you have more questions, please leave them down in the comments, and hopefully we'll have more of these coming out for you soon.